Russian President Vladimir Putin announced in 2018 the existence of 6 Russian nuclear superweapons. Russia and China are so much more aggressive now than they've been for decades because they understand they have all these advantages. You know, if it actually comes to nuclear war, they would win it. So the stakes have never been higher. It really could happen at any time. China has all the military capabilities in place today. They've mobilized their military already. They've mobilized their economy for war. We're just in an extremely bad situation where we're completely outmatched, and I don't see how the U.S. can survive it. The financial system would collapse, the dollar would be worthless, and people would begin starving to death, especially in urban areas. I think it's really important for every American, every Canadian to prepare their families. It's going to get a lot worse. We had the Deputy Commanding General of the 101st Airborne Division conducting joint military exercises just a few miles from the Ukrainian border. This is one of the most disturbing developments that I've seen.
I know myself personally drastically underestimated the capabilities of Russia and China when it came to their strategic forces, because we presume that because the U.S. has such a large military budget over the years, that we must just have superior weapons. Like, you know, it's
right.
a lot of groupthink going on. Even though a lot of this money has been put towards other things like funding these aircraft carriers floating all around the world trying to police the planet, right? Or just paying veteran pensions and stuff like that, you know, from all the wars that have been fought. Whereas Russia and China have solely focused on things like missile defense and enhancing their strategic forces. And you talk in your article about how they are 30 years ahead in nuclear technology, and you talk about the following super weapons. So you talk about the Kinzhal hypersonic weapon, the Zircon hypersonic missile, the Avangard hypersonic missile, the Sarmat, which is an intercontinental ballistic missile, the Poseidon, the Skyfall nuclear-powered missile. They have the S-550 missile defense system, and apparently you say that they have 10,000 dual-purpose surface-to-air missiles that they deploy from S-400 and S-500 missile systems, and 225 times more land-based anti-ballistic missiles. I mean, talk about being outgunned in every possible dimension. Maybe you could talk a bit about some of these super weapons that Russia has, and we haven't even talked about EMP super weapons yet.
Yeah, so Russian President Vladimir Putin announced in 2018 the existence of 6 Russian nuclear superweapons, of which I think 3 or 4 are already operational. The most alarming of those superweapons is the Poseidon underwater unmanned vehicle. And that is essentially, it's been compared to an underwater nuclear ICBM, but it's nuclear powered. It's the size of a school bus, and it's very stealthy. And it has the capability to, I think it has like a 10,000 mile range before it needs to be resupplied, perhaps with additional nuclear materials. But it's what the Russians have said its use is to create like a massive tidal wave along the Atlantic seashore, which would devastate and kill tens of millions of Americans, perhaps with as little as a single Poseidon detonation, because it has the largest nuclear warhead ever produced, reportedly 100 megatons. Could possibly be larger than that, or it might be smaller, but most analysts believe it's 100 megatons. But Dr. Peter Pry and I both believed, and I believe currently, that its more likely use is to trail U.S. nuclear submarines from their bases and destroy them at ranges of up to 50 kilometers. That's how large their explosion is, when they detonate. And so each Russian nuclear submarine, Belgorod submarine, has the capability to carry 6 of those Poseidon UUVs. And so in theory, even one fully armed Russian Belgorod submarine might have the equivalent nuclear firepower of the entire U.S. nuclear arsenal combined. And so that's something that should be very alarming. And then, as you mentioned, there's other ones. Probably the next most threatening would be the Sarmat. The Sarmat is a super heavy ICBM, which are fired out of super hardened ICBM silos, which once they're done super hardening, may be able to withstand direct nuclear hits from our ICBMs, as the Chinese have been doing with these 350 DF-41 silos they've been constructing, which is going to increase the size of their nuclear arsenal by about four to 5 times over the next 2 years. But they can these SARMAT super heavy ICBMs can carry between reportedly up to 20 to 50 low yield warheads, or they can carry as few as 15 heavy strategic warheads. So the Russians have openly talked about using only 2 SARMATs to take out all of our major cities in the United States. Our top 30 to 35 major cities, and that's very doable. And by the way, the first 50 of those, the Russians have stated, will be deployed by the end of the year. So just within the next 2 months, if they remain on schedule. And then the Zircon recently became operational. As of August, the Russians stated they were mass producing the Zircon hypersonic missile. This is primarily a submarine-launched hypersonic missile. And back in February, you might remember that President Putin actually threatened Biden that if the U.S. dared intervene in the war in Ukraine militarily with direct military force, that Russia would respond by destroying Washington, D.C. within 4 to 5 minutes from a submarine firing a Zircon hypersonic missile at a range of about 200 miles from the capital. So that's certainly a major threat. I've also assessed that a Russian submarine firing the Zircon from the Gulf of Mexico could potentially execute a comprehensive EMP attack, super EMP attack, with as few as 1 or 2 missiles within 10 minutes warning. So those are major threats as well. Now, most recently, the Skyfall, which I think is perhaps the most technically immature, in the sense that the technology is not fully ready. That is a nuclear-powered hypersonic missile, which can fly perhaps indefinitely and just kind of appear anywhere, essentially fly under the radar. That is actually, according to satellite imagery, which reported by Rebecca Koffler, who I referred to earlier, former senior DIA analyst on the Russian threat, that may be tested within the next few weeks. And then we also have the Kinzhal, which is an air-launched ballistic missile. The Chinese also have an air-launched ballistic missile that is operational, I believe, as well. That is a hypersonic missile that could be fired from MiG-31s. I think they have a range of about 1,000 kilometers. So those are some of the Russian super nuclear weapon systems that we have to worry about. And the U.S. really doesn't have any comparable system to any of these 6 super weapons. That's the crazy thing. I mean, we don't have super EMP weapons. We're not developing them. We don't have any of these super weapons equivalents, and we're not developing any of them. We are only developing conventionally armed hypersonic missiles. Now, certainly we have the capability to change that development and revise them to carry nuclear warheads without much difficulty. But at this time, we don't even have a nuclear hypersonic missile that's being planned, and so that puts us at a major disadvantage to the Sino-Russian alliance in terms of any direct military conflict.
So really, theoretically, all they would have to do for a decapitation first strike is utilize these Poseidon warheads to track down the couple submarines that are out and about. And, maybe that would, even if we were able to get all of the missiles out of a couple submarines, they would incur much less damage than we would, because targeting the bombers is easy, targeting the ports is easy, targeting the missile silos is easy. So effectively right now we would lose a nuclear war, is what you're saying.
We would absolutely lose a nuclear war with Russia or China. There's no question in my mind about that. They could execute a cyber EMP attack that could potentially adversely affect our nuclear C3, our command, control, and communications. The Chinese actually, it's been reported that the FBI has notified Congress that the Chinese have the capability to not only intercept nuclear launch orders, but actually disrupt nuclear launch orders emanating from Washington, D.C. So that could potentially eliminate our ability to fire missiles at all. But then as you mentioned, the Russians could use two nuclear warheads, or the Chinese combined could take out both of our nuclear missile submarine ports, which could take out 8 to 10 of our nuclear missile submarines in port, and then the other 4 could be destroyed with Poseidons operating in the Atlantic, and as little as one Russian Belgorod submarine in the Atlantic and Pacific. Currently, they only have one, so that would likely be used in the Atlantic because it's deployed with the Russian Red Banner Northern Fleet. And then they would, 3 nuclear weapons would destroy all of our strategic nuclear bomber bases. That would take out 300 of our strategic nuclear weapons as well. And that would leave us just with the 400 ICBM warheads that are more difficult to destroy and would take, would get presumably 1 or 2 nuclear warheads in that the Russians or the Chinese would use to take those out. But even if they didn't take those out, with the 10 to 12,000 SAM ABMs that they possess, most of which are modern S-400, S-500 ABMs that are much more advanced than anything we have, they could potentially take out at least on the range of 1,000 warheads. So if we fire 400 warheads at Russia, there's a very good possibility they could take out the vast majority of our entire second strike, retaliatory strike. So that's something that a lot of U.S. leaders don't realize, and it's why I think that Russia and China are so much more aggressive now than they've been, for decades, because they understand they have all these advantages in terms of EMP and nuclear systems, in which if it actually comes to nuclear war, they would win it.
Yeah, we just heard recently the commander of STRATCOM, Admiral Charles Richards, made some remarks that were pretty significant. He said that Ukraine is just a warm-up and the big one is coming. Those are pretty. Those are words you don't want to hear from the guy who's in charge of all the nuclear weapons, right? What do you think he is referring to with respect to that?
Well, I think Admiral Richard, he's seen the U.S. intelligence reports, estimating that the orders have already been given by President Xi Jinping to his military to prepare to attack and invade and reconquer Taiwan by the end of next year, by the end of 2023. So we have a 14-month window at most in which China is most likely to blockade and then attack and invade Taiwan. And based on Biden's own statements, that's going to lead to World War III. And any direct war with Russia or China will probably go, it will escalate to the cyber level on day one. So we could actually have the U.S. and NATO destroyed just with a comprehensive cyber attack, let alone EMP and nuclear strikes that could follow the beginning of the war. As I mentioned, within the first 6 hours of any war, we would likely lose the use of all of our satellites. So we'd be blinded and disabled and incapacitated, unable to effectively fight or resist. The U.S. has never really been in this situation. We fought World War II against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and we never faced the threat of attack on the U.S. homeland. We had Pearl Harbor against the Hawaiian Islands. We had the Japanese occupation of a couple of Aleutian islands, Attu and Kiska, that were very far removed from the U.S. mainland. But as of 1951, the Russians had a nuclear bomber that had one-way range to attack us with atomic weapons, and the threats have only gotten worse since then. And now Russia and China have the capability to destroy us in 3 or 4 different ways at least. And U.S. leaders are, as in Dr. Peter Pry's words, playing with nuclear fire. With this escalating war in Ukraine and the threats of a direct war against China over Taiwan. And it's just not in the U.S. Strategic interest. It's not in our national security interest to defend either one. We can just if we restrict ourselves to defending our treaty allies in NATO and the Pacific, that would include Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia. I think we can avoid a nuclear war with Russia and China. But Ukraine is obviously viewed as an existential fight by Russian President Putin. So we really need to find a way to compromise with Putin if we're to avoid World War III with Russia. And then Taiwan, of course, has been viewed, even admitted, the U.S. government admits that Taiwan is part of China. We just disagree on whether they have sovereignty over Taiwan or not. And, with our one China policy. So, it really is critical we have more America first leaders, like President Trump, who's been calling for peace with Russia, even volunteered to lead a U.S. diplomatic delegation to negotiate an end to the war. We have Tulsi Gabbard, who on the Democrat side recently left the Democrat Party, denounced them as a bunch of warmongers trying to encourage nuclear war. And she's absolutely right. And we just don't have enough leaders who have the vision, of even any of our Cold War presidents. All of our Cold War presidents were clear-eyed Cold War realists. They were foreign policy realists that understood the need to avert a nuclear conflict or potential escalation with the Russians and the Soviets at the time, and understood the importance of diplomatic negotiations to resolve any potential nuclear disputes. And we just don't have that right now. The President Biden has been throwing what I call 8.5 month long temper tantrum in terms of refusing to talk with Russian leadership about the war in Ukraine and how to end it. Even if we were to just simply, provide them with our terms and then try to negotiate them, even if we were far apart, even just meeting with Russian leaders, at the State Department level would be a tremendous step forward in terms of, trying to dial things down a bit and, avoid this potential nuclear conflict.
Yeah, I guess I'm a bit more skeptical about change in the political party actually having any meaningful effect on foreign policy, because I think right now it appears as though NATO's power is waning and the rise of China is ultimately going to threaten U.S. hegemony. So therefore, anybody who's in the cockpit when that happens is going to be pressured into making a move. I know that when Trump had that moment where he visited with Kim Jong-un, and everybody thought that this is the beginning of new peace relations with North Korea, and they didn't do any missile tests the following year, and then only 2 years later they did more missile tests than I think any year on record, and now they've doubled that this year. So something is going on that is outside the realm of politics, I think. What is your take on the notion that Russia won't use any nukes because it will piss off China? What is your thoughts on that? Do you think that that's a real concern, that they are waiting for the nod from Xi Jinping, or what do you think about that?
I think the opposite is the case. If Russia were, I've described since April, I've talked about how the Russian use of a limited number of nuclear weapons, tactical nukes in Ukraine would be a win-win situation for them, because the biggest thing that people fail to realize is that the Biden administration is one of the most anti-nuke, probably the most anti-nuke administrations we've ever had, certainly since the Cold War. And all of the top experts that I've talked to, none of them think that Biden would respond in kind to a Russian use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I would even go so far to argue that Biden wouldn't even retaliate with nuclear weapons if Russia were nuking NATO forces or military bases. As long as they Russia refrained from taking out major cities and killing millions of civilians, I think that Biden would try to dial it down and try to de-escalate a conflict which escalated to the tactical nuclear level. And I think you do the same with regards to potential Chinese nuclear use in the Pacific, even if it killed tens of thousands of U.S. troops. So that's is an important thing to consider.
And they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't do that because they know that it would escalate to the strategic level and we would lose.
That's right. Well, I think they still believe that it's suicide essentially. If someone used nukes and then the other country, the U.S. uses nukes in response, then it'll automatically escalate to the strategic nuclear level. And they're likely right. If we were to use, tactical nukes in response and took out Russian targets, they likely would escalate to the strategic nuclear level. But that's the reason that Biden would be highly unlikely to respond to even, tactical nuclear strikes on allied military forces, because that would be, the total destruction, annihilation of the United States. And he'd be absolutely right. But the problem is, he's not doing enough to follow the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which Kennedy actually gave up more to the Russians than they gave up to us, in which he withdrew our nuclear missiles from both Turkey and Italy, and then essentially repudiated the Monroe Doctrine and said we'd never invade Cuba to avoid a nuclear war, which he estimated would cost the lives of 100 million Americans. Now if there were a nuclear EMP war, it could result in the deaths of 280 million Americans. So the stakes have never been higher, and yet we don't. Biden has no serious strategy on how to de-escalate from the verge of Armageddon, as he put it.
Yes, and so you think then that the Chinese will say one thing for public consumption, in that they don't support the Russians doing the war. I think Xi Jinping recently said that nuclear war should never be fought, or something to that effect. So they'll say that, but that they will silently support their use.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So what we hear and see are Chinese propaganda. So they're saying one thing and doing another. That's always been the case with the Chinese Communist Party. And already we're seeing a large number of Chinese drones that are being used against Ukrainian forces. They're quote unquote civilian drones, but still, they represent increased Chinese assistance to Russia and help them to win the war in Ukraine. As I mentioned, it was likely President Xi himself that told President Putin to escalate the war in Ukraine by mobilizing the Russian military, because it was just 2 days after he returned from this SCO summit in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, that he issued his mobilization order. I think it was on the 21st of September. So China absolutely want Russia to win the war. The only concern that I think the Chinese have, that he has, President Xi has, is that he views these temporary Ukrainian battlefield victories as negatively affecting Chinese prestige, because Russia is obviously China's top ally, and so he wants to show that the Sino-Russian alliance cannot be defeated essentially by Western forces and its proxies. And the reason I stated that I think that China would be happy to see Russian nuclear use is because what will likely happen is that, as I mentioned, if Russia were to use tactical nukes in, say, an EMP mode over Kyiv and other even other Ukrainian cities, that would kill very few civilians with direct effects. And if Biden were to do nothing, then that would essentially give China the green light to use nuclear weapons similarly in a war in the Pacific, perhaps against Taiwan and other U.S. allies. But more importantly, it would likely cause Biden to not intervene militarily against China, knowing that the nuclear genie was back out of the bottle, and that China likely would escalate to the tactical nuclear level within weeks of any direct war with the U.S.
It's safe to say that we don't know much about what the Chinese, or at least the public doesn't know much about the Chinese nuclear capabilities, because we have no strategic arms reduction agreement with the Chinese. So they're able to basically do what they want undeterred. And we could presume then that they, were drastically underestimating the amount of nuclear capabilities they have. You have said that there's 350 10 warhead DF-41 ICBM missile silos under construction, and that they are trying to complete these by the end of 2024, and that date would coincide somewhat with the invasion of Taiwan. Do you think they're waiting for the completion of their the fortification of their nuclear arsenal before they do their foray into Taiwan?
I think they'd be wiser to wait till 2024 for that reason. I don't think they will. I think that already it's they might be 50% complete at this point. We just don't know for sure. But I don't think they're gonna wait until it's substantially completed. I think they believe they have sufficient nuclear firepower. I think today, if you were to ask me to guesstimate the true size of their nuclear arsenal, I would say it is likely the same or even slightly more than the number of nuclear warheads the U.S. possesses. We currently have 1,715 nuclear warheads, of which about 200 of those are tactical and the rest are strategic. But the strategic nuclear weapons are the most important measure of a nuclear superpower's nuclear might. And as I said, I think China has likely already exceeded that. So we are now likely the third strongest nuclear power on Earth, and that's a big change from the Cold War years when we were a close second to the Soviet Union.
So you think that they're going to enter Taiwan in spring of 2023? And why do you think that the timeline has been accelerated?
Well, I think that the Russia's war in Ukraine has played a major role in accelerating the timeline. I think that it would benefit China immensely if they were to attack Taiwan. As I said, beginning with the joint air and naval blockade initially, and then following on within likely a few months, an occupation or invasion, if necessary, of Taiwan. But currently, I mean, we're sending an increasing number of. I think we have 100,000 troops for the first time in over a decade in Eastern Europe. We've deployed even one of our nuclear missile submarines, which is surfaced in Gibraltar. Another one in the Arabian Sea within firing range of the Russian Federation. And so there's we only have about 15% of our air and naval power that's deployed to the Western Pacific. So, that's, those forces could be destroyed in Pearl Harbor, conventional or even tactical nuclear strikes. So I think, I think that a lot of that plays into President Xi's thinking, but also President Xi is about to turn 70. He's just, been recognized as China's paramount leader with, essentially dictator for life. And that was really the last thing that was the last thing that most military analysts thought would prevent him from invading or attacking Taiwan prior to the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. So it really could happen at any time. There's nothing. China has all the military capabilities in place today. They've mobilized a lot of their military already. They've mobilized their economy for war. They're willing to have their economic growth and capabilities reduced in order to engage in this national military mobilization that we saw leaked back in May. So. I do think it's going to happen sooner rather than later, most likely early next year.
One has to wonder if these lockdowns were not in some way preparation for putting the economy into full war mobilization mode. Because I've always told people, it's only a matter of time before the Chinese manufacturing and industrial sector just flips the switch and starts making weapons instead. And then the breakneck speed that they're going to be able to drastically grow their military, I think is going to astonish a lot of people. I mean, if you look at the rise of Germany throughout the 1930s, like within the span of a few years, they were able to build one of the most powerful militaries. So just imagine what the Chinese industrial capacity will be once they commit themselves to the task of war. I think the world has no idea what could potentially be coming with respect to that, because their entire population has now been conditioned to be put into lockdown and go under martial law. Do you have any thoughts about how the pandemic stuff relates to this World War III stuff?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think that's true. I mean, I've always said that, the Chinese economic growth and industrial manufacturing growth has really been, it's just always been a means to the end. The end is a Chinese world domination. And, China's preference has always been that it would be a peaceful expansion. It would be, a peaceful reunification with Taiwan, conquering of various other island nations that aren't U.S. treaty allies in the Pacific, and that they would essentially continue to colonize America, transform every other country into essentially a third world colonial economy in which we provide them the raw materials and the food, and they provide us with finished manufacturing goods. It's essentially almost the sole source that we're completely dependent on, and thereby force U.S. and NATO and other Pacific ally leaders to do their bidding, merely just as a matter of economic blackmail. So that's the world that they're trying to achieve. Certainly, I mean we know that China has about double the industrial manufacturing capability of the U.S. today. And that's why I think it's so interesting that so many U.S. political leaders seem to, and even national security experts seem to think that the U.S. could successfully fight a long war with China, in which we would be outproduced 4 to 6 times. The estimates I've seen are that China could outproduce us in advanced modern weapon systems by 4 to 6 times. A lot of our modern weapon systems require foreign components, including some Chinese components. At this point, the F-35 recently went offline because it was determined they were Chinese alloys, and we had to stop production. But we're just in an extremely bad situation where we're completely outmatched in so many ways. And China is, they've been fighting this unrestricted warfare against the United States for a decade or two. China will always be an enemy, but we need to peacefully coexist with our enemies, and we could have like a sphere of influence agreement with China, in which we retain a sphere of influence over our treaty allies, but their sphere expands to include perhaps Mongolia, North Korea, and Southeast Asia and Southern Africa. But in terms of Russia, they're only our enemy because U.S. policies have made them our enemy. And as Dr. Peter Pry talked about, we need to make peace, not war, with Russia, and kind of end the conflict between us with the comprehensive mutual security agreement, which would make us strategic partners, not necessarily allies, but strategic partners with Russia to neutralize their military alliance with China, and thereby end the threat of Russian nuclear missile attack on the U.S. and NATO, and at the same time reduce the chances of a Chinese nuclear attack on the United States and its allies.
How does North Korea factor into this? Because it appears to me that they're kind of the tip of the spear for the Chinese, and if the Chinese need to have some weapons sent to Russia, they might do it through North Korea, or how do you figure that and what is going on the Korean Peninsula right now? Because you got these huge war games being waged, and both sides are assuming that the other side is getting ready to invade. So why is there this sudden flare-up on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, you're absolutely right. The U.S. and South Korea have engaged in the largest war games in perhaps a decade or more. And in response, Kim Jong-un has engaged in a temper tantrum and show of force. And, I think they deployed hundreds of jet aircraft, and then they fired over a dozen ballistic and cruise missiles to show that they are a nuclear great power. But I think North Korea is, as you alluded to, is really a Chinese vassal state, and there's no way that they'll start a war without Chinese authorization. The only way that they'll get Chinese authorization is if the U.S. were to find itself, if China were to find itself in a direct war with the United States, either by virtue of us going to war against Russia, or more likely if we were to defend Taiwan militarily. Only in that situation, I think, would the Chinese authorize North Korea to invade South Korea and reconquer the rest of the Korean peninsula in order to reunify Korea.
So why are they doing these major war games now, though, is the question. Are they trying to put pressure on the Chinese? Is it sending a message? Because they're even talking about putting more nuclear capable equipment there in South Korea. I believe I heard that.
Yeah, I do think it's a matter of signaling. The timing strongly suggests that the Biden administration is signaling to China that the U.S. remains strongly engaged and has the weapon systems to try to defend Taiwan and its allies from Chinese and North Korean aggression. I mean, I think it's a good message to do, but given how close we are to potential nuclear conflict with the Sino-Russian alliance, now's not the time for military confrontation and nuclear brinkmanship. I think it's the time for diplomacy to try to get Russia and China to agree to some kind of sphere of influence agreement or a non-aggression pact in which we would perhaps mediate a reunification agreement with Taiwan, in which the KMT would essentially become the governing party under communist Chinese sovereignty, with some auspices of political and religious freedoms remaining in Taiwan.
What do you think the outcome is going to be if and when this happens next year? Because we're talking about a major war, which is likely going to only intensify in Ukraine by that time. And we're also talking about a major war where trillions in trade is conducted. Is it safe to say that most people aren't prepared for the economic fallout of such a thing?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely the issue, because I can easily see it's the way to avoid war with Russia and China is obviously very easy and simple. We just need to stop it, sending military aid to Ukraine to reach a ceasefire, pressure them to agree to a ceasefire agreement, and then come to some accommodation with China over Taiwan, which would essentially include this reunification agreement on the best terms possible for Taiwan. But even if the U.S. were not to intervene militarily in a Sino-Taiwanese war, most likely we would see a lot of the same, serious to severe economic sanctions against China that we've seen with Russia. And unlike Russia, we're heavily dependent on China for most of our manufacturing goods. So many of the things that we depend on, from in terms of 80 to 90% of our pharmaceuticals are produced by China, and a lot of other critical manufacturing goods as well. So, I mean, minimally, in the event of a Chinese move on Taiwan, I would expect Biden to respond with major economic sanctions that would severely impact the U.S. economy. And of course, they would try to do that with in concert with our NATO allies and Pacific allies as well. So minimally, we would see an economic war with China, in which the U.S. would likely move into either a severe economic recession, or perhaps more likely an economic depression. Now, I've argued that that's what we need to do. The sooner, the better we do it. We need to completely disassociate, and cut off our economic dependencies on communist China. It's a situation we can't allow ourselves to continue. And so even if they didn't invade Taiwan, I would argue for, in terms of the grand strategy for countering communist Chinese global domination, which I wrote back, I think, in August. That's a critical part of the strategy that I've had. It would include forming a trade bloc with, kind of a coalition of the willing, presumably between EU countries and most of our Pacific allies as well, and hopefully Canada, in order to cut off all dependencies on China and kind of help each other, and strengthen each other's economies in the process.
And last but not least, we haven't really talked about the Middle East. Obviously, there's a potential for things to get out of control there with the Iranian situation and Netanyahu threatening a strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. And of course, now the Iranians are becoming more associated with the Russians in this conflict, as are the North Koreans. So we're seeing the hardening of these alliances. How do you figure the Iran, Saudi, Israel matrix factors into all this?
I assess that Iran likely has already weaponized nuclear weapons, likely tested them in North Korea, and they already have IRBMs that can range Europe. They're developing ICBMs to range the United States. So they already, I believe, have a limited nuclear capability. And so there's really no chance. I think Israel likely knows that, and this is just posturing on their part, perhaps to help Netanyahu win the election, which he just won conclusively as Israel's new prime minister. But certainly, there's a major threat that if they were to be World War III and it was being fought on multiple fronts, and perhaps in Eastern Europe and Taiwan and the Western Pacific and North the Korean Peninsula as well, it's extremely likely that Iran would make moves perhaps to take out the Saudi military and perhaps occupy neighboring countries in the region, and even southern Iraq, which Iraq, of course, has become essentially an Iranian proxy state, thanks to the U.S. invasion, which destroyed the Ba'athist state of Saddam Hussein, which was actually a very useful counter for the U.S. in our fight in the war against Iranian terror, and that Reagan recognized, but that his successors failed to realize.
So, with the potential for all this stuff to go wrong, what do you think what do you put the odds at that this situation gets worse before it gets better? I mean, you're proposing a lot of solutions, and your work is very solution focused, which is, I think, a very important voice that needs to be there right now. Hopefully it gains some steam as time goes on, and maybe it will prompt, maybe the political shift might actually assist in bringing forth some meaningful change in that respect. But realistically, I personally am more pessimistic. Obviously, I'm a prepper, so I think it's just in my nature. But I know you don't like giving percentages. The lady you quoted gave a 30% chance of this escalating to the nuclear level. What do you put it at? Maybe let's say next year. What is the percentage that this situation is worse than it is now?
Well, I think it's going to get a lot worse. As I mentioned, even if we were simply, to stay out of a direct war with Russia or China or North Korea, and it simply had an economic war, which could cause almost a global economic depression with China, following their blockade and attack on Taiwan. I think it's going to get a lot worse. I think it's really important, for every American, every Canadian to prepare their families, physically, obviously, but spiritually as well. Turn back to God. But I think it's, I think the chances of World War III are likely over 50% within the next 14 months. There's just too many, we just don't have the leaders. We don't have the statesmen anymore. During the Cold War, there was no shortage of statesmen that helped us to navigate out of potential nuclear conflicts with the Soviet Union. We respected their sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. We didn't try to intervene militarily like we are today in their sphere of influence in Ukraine. There was just kind of a common sense, reasonableness to U.S. leaders that is completely lacking today, with the exception of, the America First wing of the Republican Party, which is, I would say, led by President Trump, but is a minority even within the party itself. So I do see this likely escalating to a direct military conflict with Russia and China, and I don't see how the U.S. can survive it. As I mentioned, even if it was simply a massive cyber attack, they could take out our power, our water distribution, water purification, food distribution, our communications, our internet. Businesses would come to a halt. The financial system would collapse. The dollar would be worthless, and people would begin starving to death, especially in urban areas. So yeah, I hate to be a doomsday theorist, as I've sometimes accused of being, both myself and Dr. Pry. But I tend to agree with you. I'm much more of a half glass empty kind of guy, in terms of I want to be an optimist, but realist. I'm more of a realist than anything else. And my sense of realism suggests that it's going to get much worse before it gets better. I don't think it'll ever will get better unless we can change our policies. That's really the only solution, is to change our policies to one of more of peaceful coexistence, peace through strength versus what I call war through weakness, and obviously turning back to God and praying for His for the Lord's protection for our families and our countries.
Well, I would say that, to the contrary, based on what I've read off of your work, is that you are primarily solution focused. You always, when you lay out these problems, you're not just talking about the problems, you're also trying to propose some sort of, a way that we can, like you say, make peace with Russia and China and find a way to work with them, as opposed to, escalating this further and just, basically saying, oh, well, we're doomed and there's nothing we can do about it but prepare. So I would say that you're not a glass half empty person. I unfortunately lack the faith, like you said, in our leaders, that they're going to be able to, it feels as though there are forces that are pressuring them, that it's going to take a very strong-minded individual in order to counter those forces. It just appears that they're, whether they're financial or if it's a military-industrial complex or whatever it is, something is guiding us towards collapse. And perhaps it's just the nature of our global economic system that it has to come undone, and that, whether it comes undone kinetically or, hopefully not kinetically, and hopefully if we do split, if the world splits, it's on peaceful terms at least. But it's looking as though it definitely will be kinetic. I don't think human nature has changed substantially, like a lot of people have. A lot of people think, oh, we're different now than we were back, in World War II. But I think that that's only, there's a very thin veneer of civility right now that exists because times are good. Unfortunately, that's my Freudian pessimism, I guess you could say, about human nature. But what do you suggest, in light of all of this? And I like to leave people with some sort of constructive note. You've talked about the spiritual component. In terms of genuinely trying to prepare for what the world is going to look like post-2023, what do you recommend that people do in order to get prepared for what might be coming?
Yeah, well, I appreciate you reminding your listeners that I am very solution focused. There's always there's always an answer. There's always some hope that our leaders can change, because we are where we are on the verge of nuclear Armageddon because of our policies, because of foolish U.S. and NATO policies, which have led us on this warmongering path. As you mentioned, it's bipartisan, it's multi-party, it's multi-country. Everyone seems to be, they believe that the U.S. is, is global hegemon, and that we can face down the Sino-Russian alliance, which is much more powerful than we are militarily and even economically. But in terms of preparation, we need to avoid, I would counsel your listeners to, if you're located in an urban center, to move to a more rural area. I often joke that if I was a multimillionaire, I would buy a farm that was self-sustaining, because that's really the model we had during World War II. America was entirely self-sustaining. We could manufacture all our own necessities, and it's kind of like a farm mentality that we just don't have in this country anymore. Obviously stockpiling food and water, and having solar generators with solar panels for power, for refrigeration purposes. All those are very important. Guns and ammo, unfortunately, those are critical as well, because there are going to be roving gangs and perhaps even invading forces. I live in an area which I think would be target zone for Chinese military occupation in the event of a massive EMP attack, for example.
I appreciate you joining us today, and I would encourage people to go and check out David's Substack. Very detailed articles. How often would you say you release an article? Like once a week or so?
It really varies. Sometimes it's 3 times a day. Sometimes it's it's once every 2 weeks. And I have ideas, and I actually do post things, for example, on Facebook, which I think would be very interesting. But I try to limit it to really articles of greater substance, that really are kind of think pieces that make people think, and that can make a difference on the national security debate for our leaders and our citizens. But yeah, I would encourage all of your subscribers to please subscribe to my website, my Substack website, the Real War Newsletter, at dpyne.substack.com.
And I will say that a lot of the stuff that you write, it's very comprehensive. It's very easy to read. A person doesn't have to be a military expert or anything like that. And I find it to be a very engaging read. And there's always information that I've never heard anywhere else. So I would strongly go and encourage people to check that out. And I guess we're going to have you back once again, because as this situation progresses, we're going to need more insight. Perhaps we'll shorten the gap this time and get you back sooner. So thanks a lot for coming out. And you guys go and check out Dave's Substack.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.